Hello, I'm Victor Davis Hanson, the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. And welcome to our latest installment of the Hoover Book Club, where we bring Hoover Fellows and also friends from outside Hoover to discuss their latest books, writings, columns, articles. Today, we're joined by Barry Strauss. He's our Corliss Page Dean Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Barry is a military historian, and he focuses on ancient Greece and Rome as a classicist. He received his PhD in classics and ancient history at Yale. Many of us know him from his Battle of Salamis, the naval encounter that saved Greece and Western civilization. That was named one of the best books of 2004 by the Washington Post. Barry's also currently, and has been for 3 decades, the Bryce and Edith Bomar Professor in Humanistic Studies at Cornell. His most recent book, and the one we are discussing today, is The War That Made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian at Actium. I want to, as a side note, point out that I reviewed this book in the realclearpolitics.com. You can get it online on March 15th. And we're going to talk about some different aspects, but there's a very laudatory review of the great book that's on Real Clear Politics. And I'd also finally note that Barry and I were students in 1977 and 1978, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, along with another Stanford classicist, Josiah Ober. And all three of us, it would just turned out to be happenstance that we were all looking at the status of Athens after the war from cultural, social, economic, and agricultural aspects. So we've known each other a long, long time. And with that, we'll start. Barry, you've written on the Battle of Salamis, the Trojan War, the Spartacus War, and then a series of wars in your Masters of Command. And of course, the death of Caesar had a lot about the war. Of all of these wars that we see change history, Marathon, Salamis, Carthage, your title suggests that maybe Actium was underappreciated in its historical importance. It really did alter the course of what Rome would become.
Yes, thanks, Victor, and it's great to be here, and always great to be with you after all the years we've known each other, as you said. Yes, I do think that Actium is underappreciated in its historical importance, in part because there was a school of thought that said, well, it really wasn't much of a battle and everything was determined beforehand. There's some truth to that, but I think that underestimates the campaign, military campaign, but also because the consequences of things had gone the other way at Actium would have been very great. If Antony and Cleopatra had won the war, then the Roman Empire would have looked eastward, and Alexandria would have become a Constantinople centuries before Constantinople. The center of gravity of the empire would have gone eastward, and the empire would have been much more of a Greek-based empire than a Latin-based empire. I think that the Romans would have been much less interested in expanding in Northern and Western Europe than they were, much more interested in expanding in Southwestern Asia, so what is now Iraq and maybe even Iran. And the Roman Empire that would have developed would have looked much more to the east than it did. So yeah, I think it would have been a big difference.
And even you hint at times in the book that even modern Europe as we know it, i.e. Northwestern Europe, might have been more influenced by Hellenism than agrarian Latin values, maybe even philologically or constitutionally or in a variety of ways, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think philologically, linguistically, the language we speak might be based more on Greek than on Latin. Yeah. As English is based more on Latin than Greek. And culturally, the religion of the West might have been more akin to Orthodoxy than to Latin Christianity. And that would have had big influences on politics as well, of course.
At this point, I wanted to get into the book very quickly, but maybe, Barry, for a minute or two, you can remind everybody that's listening that's unacquainted with Actium. Just give us who was there, what was the fight ostensibly in the short term over.
Yeah, so this was a naval battle that capped a campaign that had been going on for 6 months, and a war that had been going on for a year, but in a way, a war that had been going on for at least 15 years, a decade and a half, a war over the future of the Roman Empire. There were two giants who dominated the Roman Empire and the ruins of the Roman Republic. In the West, we had Octavian, who called himself Caesar. He was the great nephew of Julius Caesar. He was adopted posthumously in Caesar's will after Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. And in the East, there was Marcus Antonius, or as we call him, Mark Antony. He had been one of Caesar's lieutenants, and he was a military man. And his power in the East came partly from the Roman legions that he commanded and the authority that he had from the Roman Senate, but also from his alliance, both in the bedroom and politically, with Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. And the war was over really who would dominate the Roman world. Because Roman politics had shown again and again that the Roman Empire, as vast as it was, wasn't big enough to have two men dominating it. It would always go to one. It was, Marius versus Sulla, Caesar versus Pompey, and this was the latest instance of that. Would it be Antony or Octavian who dominated this world?
Maybe we should tell everybody, Barry, where Actium is. I think you and I first went there in our lives in 1977, and we had a colleague, Bill Murray, who spent most of his life on that site, who was a very close friend of yours.
That's right.
Where is Actium?
So Actium is in northwestern Greece. It's south of a place that many people will have heard from tourism, and that's the island of Corfu, and it's north of the Peloponnesus. It's in a much lesser visited region of Greece. Actium's on the coast, of the northwestern coast of Greece. It was originally a religious site and a small town. It's at the entrance to a large inland body of water, the Gulf of Arto, or the Gulf of Ambracia, which makes it of strategic importance. But there wasn't really much of a city, a settlement there at the time.
And if you want to go there and climb up on the hill and look over the battle, there's a famous inscription, and there's some still antiquities that are kind of remarkable, aren't there?
Yeah, it's a great place. I highly recommend it. So the modern Greek town is called Preveza. It's a small city. North of the entrance to the Gulf is where Octavian built his camp, his headquarters, about 5 miles north of the entrance to the Gulf. And after the battle, he set up a gigantic victory monument there. It really would have been spectacular. All we have are the ruins of it, and there's a beautiful inscription, or part of it, commemorating his victory there. Later on, it became a pretty important city in the Byzantine period. So there's some really nice ruins of the Byzantine city, late Roman city. Well, now, it wasn't there when we visited Victor long ago, but now there's a really nice museum there as well. After his victory, Octavian built a city at the site of his victory, which he modestly called Victory City, Nicopolis. And there's very nice antiquities in this particular museum.
So the battle itself, Antony and Cleopatra have been camped there, and it's not necessarily a healthy landscape.
No.
And they have a problem because while there are Roman soldiers and Egyptian soldiers, they have kind of a bi-national command. And so they're not a pure Egyptian force or a pure Roman force. And then you have this expeditionary fleet coming to encounter them. And there's Octavian, he's got this brilliant guy, Marcus Agrippa. So walk us through very quickly, Barry, what happens when the two fleets meet, and why does Cleopatra lose?
Okay, so On paper, at any rate, Antony and Cleopatra should have won. They had a bigger fleet. Their ships were technically better, more state of the art. They had reinforced prows on their ships, which meant they would be stronger at head-to-head ramming. And although most of their ships were 5 and 6 sets of rowers per room, as we say, they did have a few giant ships that could be used to break through harbor defenses. So they should have done really well. And their problem was that, because, as you said, this brilliant admiral that Octavian had, Marcus Agrippa, he cut off their supplies. He'd attacked their supply bases in the rear at place after place after place, and they couldn't feed their army. They were encamped too long in the kind of unhealthy lowlands around Actium. Their soldiers were getting sick, and they were deserting. They, in fact, had a multi-ethnic polyglot army. And they were deserting in droves to the enemy. So they had to leave. They couldn't compete against Octavian and Agrippa, who played all their cards right. When it actually got to the time, so what they decided to do was to fight a breakout battle. They would, if they possibly could, they would try to smash into the enemy's fleet and do a lot of damage to it. They knew that was a long shot, and probably the best they could do was to escape with as many ships as they could. They were in such bad straits, they actually had to burn some of their ships before the battle, a fair number of their ships, because they couldn't man them. They didn't have enough healthy crewmen that they could use to man these ships. They also had to abandon their land army, which they left at Actium. Pretty desperate situation.
So they go down the coast of Greece, and then they hop over across the Mediterranean. They get back at Alexandria.
Yeah.
But Actium is basically, after that defeat, they're sort of on life support in Alexandria, and they know they know what's coming, right? And what was coming to them?
Yeah. So what was coming to them was Octavian went eastward, and he brought legions. He brought legions with them and gathered allies. All the cities, all the countries in the east, the Roman client kingdoms that had been on Antony's side, suddenly say, "Oops, we're now on Octavian's side." Most famous example is King Herod, the infamous King Herod, who was really quite a power unto his own right, and he went hat in hand begging Octavian for forgiveness, and Octavian forgave him, and he supplied Octavian's army in a big way. Egypt was really very defensible. It's very hard to get to on land, and there are big fortresses both on east and west. Antony had a fair amount of troops there. The trouble was they could see which way the wind was blowing, and Cleopatra decides to try to make a separate peace with Octavian and ditch Antony. She cares more about her dynasty and her children. She has 4 children, 3 of them by Antony, 1 of them probably by Caesar, and she's looking to the future and the possibility that these kids will survive and inherit the throne that her dynasty's been on for 300 years. And she's willing to give up Antony for that. And she hardly has to tell the guys manning these forts to surrender.
So it's kind of in a weird, strange way, it's kind of a family affair, because Antony is the former brother-in-law of Octavian, married to Octavia.
Yeah.
And his great uncle Caesar is not, I mean, he has had this liaison with Cleopatra, and his lieutenant, his main loyalist was Antony. So it's a very incestuous power play between these players, isn't it?
It is utterly incestuous. It is one of history's greatest soap operas. When you read the details, you can hardly believe they're true, and you kind of think, surely they're making this stuff up, but they're not.
Why don't we walk, Barry, through the main players? So one thing I think our listeners and everybody who reads ancient history is dumbfounded. So when Caesar technically starts the civil war by breaking a senatorial rule that he crosses the Rubicon, his grandnephew's only, what, 14, Octavian? He's just a little punk kid.
That's right, he's 14.
And then when Caesar's killed, he's what, 18 going on 19? Or is
That's
he,
right. Yeah.
so he's still underestimated, and in Roman literatures, remember, they refer to him as a young boy, or they
Right. Yeah.
he had
Yeah.
habitually he gets sick before battle.
Right.
What happened? How does this kid that's 14 and then 19, and then there's these iterations of the Civil War. Caesar's fighting Pompey, and then Pompey's gone, and then the sons of Pompey. He has to
Right.
get rid. He's got to get rid of the senatorial opposition, and then the coalition turns on each other. Antony, and through all of these iterations, he ends up at what, 28 at Actium. He's still a punk.
He's
And
a
I mean,
punk. But
how does he outsmart everybody that is so much more experienced and
he's
knowledgeable?
read Machiavelli before Machiavelli. I mean, the guy is just incredibly cunning. And we've all known people like this, even in high school. We've known people who just, focused on ambition. They just want to get ahead, and they'll do whatever it takes. I think he was one of these guys. He just was incredibly smart, and he ingratiated himself to Julius Caesar at a young age. He sat at Caesar's feet, especially in Spain. He's soaking everything up from Caesar, learning from the guy, convinces Caesar that he's the one, he's the guy. Caesar changes his will and, makes Octavian as his heir. Caesar sees something in this guy. He's got that X factor that means he can go the distance.
So Cato, the younger Cato, kills himself, big revolutionary figure. Cicero is executed with his hands and his head nailed up on the rostrum. Caesar is stabbed to death. I guess we can say that the myth of Cleopatra, however she died, the myth is she was bitten by an asp. You discuss that in the book. And then we have Mark Antony that kills himself, and Octavian then dies in sleep at 77.
That's right.
Peacefully. And
peacefully, if you believe Robert Graves and the rumors and Tacitus, he was poisoned by his wife. No, that's a little too good a story for me. But God lives into his 70s. He's frustrated in his attempt to create a blood dynasty. He only has one birth child, his daughter, by his first wife. And she's immensely fertile and has lots of kids, but none of them make it to adulthood. And in the end, he's forced to accept the son by his second wife, Livia, his stepson, as his heir, which doesn't make Octavian very happy. By then he's Augustus. But he does live a really long time. He's one cunning, shrewd guy. When he goes to the Senate, he wears armor. He's not fooling around like Caesar. He's very careful.
And this marks, in traditional classical periodization, I mean, some people have said maybe that the dual destruction of Corinth and Carthage in 146, but most agree that 31 ends the Hellenistic period and starts the Roman Principate Empire, so to speak. So he's going to be in charge now as the first citizen and gradually absorb all of these extra legal powers and turn into, I guess we could say, not quite a benevolent dictator, but a dictator that wasn't as bad as what followed. And he does this from 31 till he dies in his sleep for 46, how many years?
14, he dies in 14.
14, so he does it from 31 all the way to 14. And he gets ill and everything, but he survives all of these intrigues. And we wonder why Virgil, author of the great Aeneid, the Eclogues, the Georgics, or Horace's Odes, and we see one of the criticisms of them is they were toadish or they were obsequious, but we weren't alive when people really did owe Augustus for this 4 decades of peace and tranquility compared to what was before and what followed, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think people, yes, they did suck up to Augustus, but by the same token, I think they were just so relieved that the civil wars were over. I mean, it had been really awful, and now there's peace.
Let's talk about this other guy it's one of these strange guys, Agrippa, that's brilliant. He's probably got as much innate talent as everybody, but he seems to be 100% loyal to Octavian, and he stays that way most of the time, and he's very gifted.
Right.
Is that do you attribute a lot of the success at Actium and before and after to Agrippa?
Yes, I do. I mean, he was, a brilliant field general, absolutely brilliant. He was very inventive, and he knew a lot about strategy as well. I think that one of the reasons that the team works is that Octavian is willing to defer to Agrippa when necessary and to let it be known that he deferred to Agrippa. Our sources tell us, for instance, that on the eve of the Battle of Actium, Octavian said, we should let Antony and Cleopatra sail away. That's our best hope. And then we'll mop up afterwards. And Agrippa says, no, boss, that's a terrible idea. We should fight a battle. And Octavian says, yeah, you're right. I guess so. I think it's amazing that this is in the sources. And we think that this comes from Augustus's memoirs that they write. So Octavian, of course, becomes Augustus, takes that name. He wrote memoirs which haven't survived, but we have sources that say, well, I read Augustus's memoirs, so I got this from. The fact that Augustus lets the story be known, I think really speaks a lot about the guy. And one of the reasons he was so successful, he had this political sense of what you could and couldn't do. He knew his own limitations, but he also knew who he was dealing with, and he knew that Agrippa wasn't going to turn around and then take power from him.
His great uncle is not a player because he's been dead,
right?
43 all the way to 31, so he's been dead 12 years. But in what way did Octavian differ from his great uncle? I mean, he didn't have the military genius of a Caesar,
right?
And Caesar lived in a much more dangerous and troubled. He was a fish that swam in more dangerous waters in some ways, but he obviously had gifts that Caesar didn't have. He didn't have the Clementia Caesaris that Caesar did.
No.
Is that the naivete? Is that what that Caesar suffered from? That his magnanimity, he thought, would always win people over.
A naivete and an arrogance, I think. Caesar was a patrician. He came from the bluest of blue blood. Octavian didn't. Octavian was a Roman noble only by virtue of his mother's mother. His father was kind of a real second-rate guy. Like, he would be like a provincial banker from our point of view, or someone who'd made a lot of money selling cars or something like that. Someone like Antony just has contempt for Octavian, and his speeches are full of this snobby invective. The guy's ancestor was a baker, a money changer. The family came from Africa, he says. And I think this represents what a lot of the nobility thought of Octavian. Who is this guy who thinks he's a patrician? I mean, Caesar dies, and he illegally posthumously adopts Octavian. There's no such thing as posthumous adoption in Roman law. This is nonsense, and Octavian knows it. And as soon as he gets power, he makes the assemblies pass a law saying he's legally adopted. He calls himself Gaius Julius Caesar. We call him Octavian, but he never did. He called himself Gaius Julius Caesar. In fact, he was insulted if anyone called him Octavian, which legally that would have been his name, Caesar Octavianus. And I think a lot of Romans, especially nobles, would say, who does he think he is? And then he marries. You don't get any higher on the pecking order than marrying Livia Drusilla. This is it. This is as high as the Roman nobility goes. It's a little bit like Meghan Markle marrying to the British royal family. It's not totally off that analogy. What people think, who do these people think they are? And, Octavian's a little bit like that from the point of view of the nobility. I don't think from the point of view of ordinary Romans. But he is one shrewd guy, just a real shrewd.
And so the other two, and we'll start with Cleopatra. We have some later representations of us, and to be frank, she doesn't seem so stunning. But what is it about her that everybody's, when you say, even today, she's a Cleopatra, what was the allure or the unknown quantity about her that made her so seductive or so sensuous or so adroit in manipulating men? I mean, she manipulated a lot of very capable men, Caesar, and but not Octavian. But she did she did seduce Antony and his great uncle and other people as well. So what was it about her? What was her talent?
You know, Plutarch's, well, first of all, she was phenomenally intelligent and ambitious. I mean, she was as smart as they come and as shrewd as they come. You know, she had known how to survive in a brutal family. I mean, always in the Macedonian monarchy, getting to the throne was a blood sport. And, you know, her sister wanted to kill her. She probably arranged for her sister to be killed, and at least for one of her brothers to be killed. She fought the other one in a war. Plutarch said she just was amazingly seductive and charming, and intelligent. She knew how to manipulate people. She was a gifted linguist. She spoke something like 7 languages, and she just had this appeal. We don't really know what she looked like. I mean, she would put her image out in different ways for different audiences. I mean, the coins make her look downright ugly. But she wants to look masculine on the coin. She wants to look like her father. The Greco-Roman sculpture makes her look kind of attractive. Yeah. And the Egyptian relief sculpture makes her look like a typical Egyptian queen. So yeah, we don't really know. But yeah, Plutarch says it's less her physical appearance than her charms and her seductiveness.
I know it's controversial given the post Martin Bernal, who was a former colleague of yours who wrote Black Athena, but ostensibly she's Greek, or I should say Macedonian. She's a direct descendant of the Ptolemaic line that goes all the way back through the successor general of Alexander the Great. Is it fair to say that people of the time felt that she was Greek and not native Egyptian?
Well, it's a really interesting question. She's definitely a direct descendant of Ptolemy. There's at least one Persian in her family tree, and there may be 2 Egyptians. I mean, there's some reason to think that her mother came from a family of Egyptian priests, and they had maybe married into the Ptolemies as well, so she was maybe part Egyptian, maybe her grandmother as well. That's a little iffier. She certainly, Greek was her native language. I mean, she certainly was Greek, and, you know, she presided over a Greek-speaking court. She maybe was part Egyptian. Octavian certainly always portrays her as Egyptian, but he's not doing that because he's trying to be politically correct. Just the opposite. He's doing that because he tries to insult her and say, "You're not Greek, you're Egyptian. We're fighting Egyptian."
How about, we have this strange view of Mark Antony in popular literature, film, sort of a big blustery guy, macho man, drinks, womanizes, not too bright. We get a little bit of that from Plutarch's life of Antony. And he becomes a villain, especially we have the famous Philippics of Cicero. To what degree is that stereotype accurate, that he was a slave to his appetites, or he became a slave? But at some point he was a master rhetorician, wasn't he? And he was a loyal tribune and lieutenant of Caesar in those really hard years when Caesar was in Gaul.
I mean, he was a very experienced soldier, and he has some real wins to his credit, particularly the Battle of Philippi, where he defeats Brutus and Cassius. And Cassius was a really good soldier, so he has to get a lot of credit for that. And he is, as you say, a master rhetorician. And the other thing that he does that's really impressive is he basically he negotiates Rome's diplomatic settlement in the East. You know, he lines up all these client kings who are guarding the eastern marches of the Roman Empire and do a pretty good job. He also handles the crisis when the Parthians invade. They conquer Syria and Judea, and he's got a real problem on his hands, and he deals with that very well. He has a very talented lieutenant, Sosius, who he sends to deal with that problem. So he's not simply just a hard-drinking, hail fellow, well-met. He's just not very smart. He's got some real skills. But that being said, he's no match in the cunning department for Octavian, no match for Cleopatra, and he's no match as a commander with Agrippa. He's really very good, but he has to be great, and that's his problem. He's not good enough to match them. Sadly, one of the things he's best known for as a general is leading successful retreats. It's not really what you want.
One of the things, it's hard, you know, we think that because Actium is in 31 and compared to Canine 2016 or Zama 2002 or Marathon 490 or Salamis or Thermopylae, but we actually don't have a lot of good firsthand sources. So as a historian, you're sort of stuck between Livy and Tacitus, and you rely on Plutarch's Life of Antony that can and cannot incorporate all of that was written about, I guess, 100 AD. Yeah. And then you have a little bit, I suppose, in Diodorus and Velleius and things, but it's kind of harder to write about Actium, isn't it, than even earlier battles, given the source problem.
Yeah, really big source problem, because also we're just getting it from, it's mostly Augustus's point of view, Octavian's point of view. Very little has survived from Antony or Cleopatra's point of view, but we've got a lot of coins, and they're very helpful. The information we get from coins, and also our friend Bill Murray and Costas Zakos did this terrific work at the Victory Monument at Actium. Octavian put up prows from the ships that Antony had, and we learn a lot about the ships and what Antony's got in his got on his side. We learned a lot about what the ships, what his strategy was, what he could have done. If Antony had been Caesar, he would have taken that fleet and he would have invaded Italy. He had the real possibility of breaking through a heavily fortified place like Brundisium. That's what the point of the fleet was. There's no way Caesar would have sat in on the west coast of Greece and waited for the enemy to come. And I think the real problem with Antony, he's not enough of a risk taker. He's lost whatever capacity he might ever have had to take a risk. Perhaps because he had his head handed to him in his attempted invasion of the Parthian Empire, where he goes ahead of his siege train, and the enemy just comes and destroys his siege train behind him and cuts up his logistics, so he's stuck. That, I think, might have made him overly risk averse in the Actium War, and so he's waiting for the enemy to come, and the enemy comes good and hard and really gives it to him. So
you talked about that in Masters and Commanders, and that really, I think we underestimate Kellertoss, or what the Romans called quickness, because when Caesar consolidates power, every time there was an uprising, Winnie Witty Weeky, he's off to the Pontus, he's down to where Cato is, he's into Spain at the very moment's notice, and that trait we see with Alexander the Great as well. Quick. Napoleon, that famous aphorism, gentlemen, if you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. In other words, you never dawdle. And that seems to be a very important trait that I don't even know if Octavian had it. Agrippa did, I think.
Agrippa did. I mean, we don't want to totally underestimate Octavian. We don't know who came up with the strategy that they followed at Actium. I'd like to think that Octavian learned that from his great uncle Caesar, that if you want to win a war, you just can't sit and wait for the enemy to come. You just got to go out and take some risks. That's tremendously important. And I think that more than anything else is why Antony lost. And we don't know if it's because he lost his nerve or because Cleopatra, who controlled the purse string, she financed the navy. She paid for it, and her architects built it. We don't know if she's just saying, no, there's no way we're invading Italy, or if he was stuck. He just can't invade Italy because he's got the Egyptian queen with him. That's not going to go over politically. It'd be a very tough sell, though a possible sell. And he can't get rid of her because she won't go. She said, if I go, the money goes too. A lot of his allies wanted him to get rid of her, but she doesn't trust him. She knows that if she goes back to Egypt, Octavian's going to come in and say, hey, want to remarry my sister who you just divorced? We can make peace again. That's what's going to happen. That's what I think.
Why don't we just take a 10-minute detour or 5-minute or 3-minute on the topic of, we talk about Actium and ancient sea battles.
Right.
And there's a lot of misinformation or I don't know what misconceptions about ancient sea battles. So these ships are oared vessels, and
Yeah.
they have rams, but they also have various the corvus, or they have various siege craft, so to speak, and they have some artillery. But how in this battle do they power sail? Where when she's breaking out, are they rowing and on? Can you do that in the ancient world? How, just explain how one side beats the other when they're at this in the Gulf at Actium.
So in a naval battle in the ancient world, normally you want to make your ships light. You take the masts down, they're portable, they're removable, and you take the sails off. It's going to be just powered by rowing, by manpower, not by wind. What's unusual about Actium is that Antony and Cleopatra have their masts and their sails on their ship, ready to go. And the reason for that is they're waiting for the north wind to blow up, which it does regularly every afternoon. And that will allow them to speed southward and to escape. It also, however, makes it very difficult for them to ram because their ships are heavy. So, you know, in the beginning, Antony wants to ram the enemy, but Agrippa, who knows what Antony's plan is, because one of Antony's top generals had defected to Agrippa at the last minute, defected to Octavian and Agrippa. Agrippa waits a nautical mile away. His line of ships, the ships are lined up opposite each other, the fleets are. Agrippa's a nautical mile away. That means that Antony's men have got to row hard over a nautical mile, so a little more than a regular mile, in order to get to the enemy's fleet. By the time they're there, they're pretty tired. It's really hard to ram effectively after that when you're schlepping the masts and the sails on your ships and they're so heavy. This doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
No.
Getting back to the theme of your book, that this changed attitudes. We today, at least until recently, we're sort of Northwestern Eurocentric. So we look at Northern Europe and we see France and Germany and the Low Countries and Scandinavia as this economic juggernaut, and then Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and Asia less developed. But that was just the opposite in the ancient world. And I think maybe you could argue that Northwestern Europe really didn't take off until the discovery of the New World. They had Atlantic ports, so they had advantages to get to go around the Cape of Good Hope to get to China, but also they had access to the New World's riches, and that helped. And then in addition, they were a long way from the Ottoman Empire, which the Eastern Europeans kind of saved them. And then I don't know if I don't want to get into controversial territory, but maybe the Protestant Reformation put a little bit more emphasis on capitalism and going to heaven by being wealthy. But what I'm getting at is we don't really appreciate sometimes that was just the opposite in the ancient world, that Egypt and Asia Minor and the Near East were where the money was, and not so much the status of these countries I just mentioned, the EU powerhouses, was pretty tribal and backward at this time, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were the underdeveloped world, and there's no question that Antony wanted the East because that's where the money was, and that's where the cities were, so it was easier to collect taxes. Antony has, an endless amount of money to pay for his fleet and to pay his, not endless, there are some money problems, but it's got a lot of money, doesn't have to raise taxes for this battle. Octavian has to raise taxes in Italy, and there's huge opposition, there are riots, there's violence because the taxes he has to raise to pay for his fleet and to finance this war. The war is really unpopular. It's so unpopular that he has to bring the whole Roman Senate with him. You don't usually bring the Senate with you if you're going off to war. And the reason he does that is he thinks they're going to defect to Antony if he leaves them behind. So it's really a contrast.
And is the East wealthier because A, they're closer to the wealth and the trade routes to China and India, and B, they've had this sort of head start with the Greek city-states and Asia Minor and for 500 years, while Italy is an agrarian republic, and they've got sophisticated science and that tradition. is so rich, much richer. Is that why this area is so coveted by Rome, that that
Yes,
explains its wealth?
That explains a lot of its wealth. In the case of Egypt, there's the additional factor of the Nile and the regular annual flooding of the Nile. So this is just, it's the Midwest. It's this fabulous farmland. And Egypt's got it. We think of Egypt as a desert nowadays, but in antiquity it was anything but. So it's just very wealthy, and they've collected all this treasure. One of the reasons that one of the things prizes for Octavian and Actium is Cleopatra's got a lot of her treasure with her. She doesn't dare leave it behind in Egypt. He really wants that treasure. And when she leaves, has the treasure on her ships. I think Octavian, in a sense, feels great. I've won the battle. I have a bunch of ships and I have all these soldiers who I now have to feed and I have to provide land for in Italy, or they'll riot. So it's not entirely a decisive victory.
So when the battle is over and
Yeah.
then the mop-up is over, then Egypt becomes the imperial province of the emperor, his private purse, and that's because of the wealth coming in from wheat, and is shipped into Rome. I mean, people do they get to the point very quickly? Without Egyptian wheat, they're in bad shape, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Remember, one of the reasons the Romans had not annexed Egypt is the Senate was jealous. They didn't want any one Roman general to get the credit of annexing Egypt and to build up all the clients that he would have had he annexed Egypt. So Egypt, in a way, survives in independence mainly because the Romans are fighting each other. When Antony gets Egypt with Cleopatra, this is a major coup. This guy, he's got the golden goose here. That really scares Octavian.
It's kind of like what Ukraine is to Russia, isn't it? It's a spread basket, and it's the one thing they want to get the hold of.
That's right. Yeah.
And so they get Egypt. It becomes, after the battle, it becomes an imperial province, and then for the next 2 centuries, we get sort of, because of this battle, we have, I guess we could call it the first globalization. So then Roman, as the empire expands, I guess you could argue after the death of Augustus, expands very little according to his will, but here and there. And then within the confines of, I guess we could say, I don't know, 1 million square miles, 70 million people, from Britain all the way to the Euphrates, and maybe from the Danube and the Rhine all the way to the Atlas Mountains. You got this huge area after Actium, and then you have the Neronian mess, but then we have the 5 good emperors, and we have because of Augustus's legacy, you have a kind of a veneer of sameness through all these places, right? That's part of the legacy in the East. And in a little bit northern, there's fora, there's habeas corpus, there's aqueducts, there's a modicum of uniformity, and things tend to be pretty good.
Yeah.
And that's all because of the end of the cessation of this inner fighting, and then the establishment of a uniform system that follows from Actium.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are lots of rebellions, and the Romans have a pretty small army to try to govern 70 million people, only about 300,000 men in the army. But on the whole, it is a period of several centuries of relative peace and relative prosperity. It's a pretty great achievement.
Yeah. When you finish, when you talk about, and everybody hears, this is the war that made the Roman Empire, if I can say. So what's your own feelings? That I know you're a Philhellene, and you emphasize more in Greek than Rome, but all classicists have to be proficient in both cultures and language. So do you think that this was a fortuitous idea or a fortuitous event, that Rome remained Latinized and it would incorporate Northwestern Europe and Roman Catholicism and et cetera, or there are parts of you that wished that there was an Orthodox future for the entire empire? And what became Constantinople in the 4th century was sort of I guess what I'm saying is that had they won Actium, what we know as the Byzantine Empire would have been earlier.
That's
And
right.
so there would have been a proto-Byzantine Empire rather than a Western Empire.
Yeah. Well, I think with Cleopatra in charge, there would have been certain things that would have been just fabulous about this early Byzantine Empire. But the thing, as you know, about the West is the emphasis on freedom. And, you know, freedom survives in the West partly through Roman failure, partly because the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West leaves space for freedom to come back after it suffers quite a bit in the Roman Empire. Would that have happened if there had been, you know, Byzantium before Byzantium? I don't know. That would have been that would have certainly been one thing that would have been lost. So
we kind of see that a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe we see a little bit in that second and failed, but very ambitious effort of Justinian and Belisarius to kind of recoup an entirely Greek. And I guess what you're saying is, had Actium turned out differently, we could see sort of a proto Belisarius and Justinian, because they did get into Italy, and
they did,
and there's a lot of Byzantine churches at Ravenna, and they had a pocket there for 400 or 500 years in Sicily, and they conquered North Africa again until Islam came along. But it is a different. We have kind of, you know, Byzantine is a pejorative word in our modern lexicon, but in fact, when you look at the achievement of 1,000 years beyond the West, there had to be something there, because they lived in a pretty rough neighborhood themselves.
Yeah, and you know, our friends in Greece would be very happy with, you know, more successful orthodoxy, and you know, Russia, for despite its current flaws as a civilization that's achieved a lot, and they were deeply imprinted by Eastern Orthodoxy. So you know, it's had a lot of influence and achieved greatness.
I can remember being in my apartment on May 29th, 1978, and somebody knocking on the door and saying, "It's Black Tuesday. You always, can you give a donation to the church?" And then I said, "Well, explain what this day means to you." And said, "Well, the marbleized emperor was marbleized and taken off by the archangels right out of Santa Sophia, and he's going to come back." And he almost came back in 1921 and 22 when we were, you know, so many miles outside, and we had the megala idea, the idea that the Asia Minor, Alexandria, that would be another Greek lake. And then I remember her saying to me, because it was a very anti-American period, as you remember, with the start of PASOK was in control, and there'd been the coup 4 or 5 years earlier. The coup had ended, I should say, the junta. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Well, you know, you are all wealthy because for years we were enslaved fighting the Turk, and everybody in the Balkans kept the Turk at bay, and they only got to Vienna. But if we hadn't have been here." And so there is a sense to even today that Eastern Europe, but especially the Greek-speaking Balkans and the Orthodox religion, have played a role that's underappreciated in the West, I think.
I think they have a point.
Yeah, and it's not just a chip on their shoulder, huh?
It's not just a chip on their shoulder. It is underappreciated in the West, and
it's a very developed theory and philosophy, because as I remember talking to a lot of my Greek friends, they said, "Well, you were wealthy because France and Spain and the Netherlands and Britain, you all had ports on the Atlantic Ocean, and we were bottled up, and we were fighting Turkey, and we allowed you, when you couldn't get to China and India, you had seacraft. So yes, you had sails, and you went to, you know, you had all the silver and gold of Mexico and South America, et cetera, but we put the cork in the Ottoman bottle for you while you did that, and then we never advanced because we were trapped in the Mediterranean with oared vessels while you were experimenting with galleons and everything." It's a very developed theory about how different the world would have been. Let me ask Barry. I think everybody, because you've written this series, it's an incredible series of books, 10 or 12 in the last 13 years. What are you working on now?
So I'm writing a book called Rebels. It's about Jewish revolts against Rome.
Against Rome.
against Rome in the first 2 centuries. Yeah.
Are you going to do a what would have happened had they won Syria again scenario if the rebellions had been successful?
I'm going to do a what would have happened if they had won, and what would have happened if they hadn't rebelled.
Had they, I know it's early in your research, had they not rebelled or had they won, there wouldn't have been a Jewish diaspora as we know it throughout Europe, or not?
Well, there already was a Jewish diaspora. Yes. I mean, quote unquote, Babylon, southern Iraq was a huge Jewish community. And of course, there's big Jewish diaspora in Egypt, Alexandria, and in Antioch, and some in Rome. I don't think they could have won without the help of the Persians, without the help of Parthia. And so to imagine them winning is to imagine Parthia coming back in a big way in what was the Roman Empire.
You think had they either not rebelled or had they won, the status of Jewishness, if I could use that term, would be different today?
Definitely. I mean, and there's a lot of speculation, but there's certainly scholars, including Israeli scholars, who say, you know, Herod had it right. The Romans weren't that bad. The Jews simply should have just learned to live under the Romans. And then the question is, well, would the Jews then have survived, or would they have ended up like the Phoenicians? You know, they didn't rebel, they lived under the Romans, but Phoenicians, not so many Phoenicians around today. And people who are descended from the Phoenicians, of course, but not a Phoenician state or anything like that.
It's fascinating how many people their modern status in the world, or their modern 20th century, 21st century, has something to do with their ancient relationship with Rome. I know that that whole German tradition of kind of scary nihilist tradition of Hegel or Nietzsche or Oswald Spengler, they all talk about Germany was never Mongolized. It was always pristine. It was beyond the Danube. It was beyond the Rhone. It was a blood and soil Tacitus. That book, I think, the most dangerous book. It was a really good book. I reviewed that. Germans today feel they were not part of the Roman Empire, and that was a good thing, because you could tell a German by his superficial appearance in a way you couldn't tell a Roman. And that really was a strong, I mean, I hate to say it, but that was a contributing factor philosophically, I guess, to what became National Socialism.
Yeah, well, they certainly used that idea. The Germans, you know, had probably the most successful rebellion against the Romans. The Germans under Arminius, when they defeat the Romans in the Teutoburger Woods, that's really one of the most important battles in history.
And you mentioned freedom, and that's a German word, isn't it? Freiheit. And
Freiheit, yes.
Unlike libertas, which I guess is the ability to have a sense of freedom within a constitutional system or within a sophisticated government, unlike a natural freedom.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are many different peoples in antiquity who had notions of freedom. I mean, the Greeks did, the Jews did, but you also have to have a certain amount of power to make it work.
We have about 4 or 5 minutes, Barry, very quickly. So let me just let our listeners and viewers get some ideas. So you get these ideas about these books about antiquity.
Yeah.
And what's your modus operandi? You read secondary sources first, and then you go into primary, and then you travel to the place. Walk us through it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I try to start with the primary sources, but pretty quickly you have to get into the secondary sources because you have to interpret them.
And those are mostly in Latin and Greek, aren't they? Almost always.
They're mostly in.
And when you say primary, you're talking everything from literature to primarily history, but also epigraphic inscriptions, or
definitely, you have to use inscriptions, papyrus, coins are really pretty important as well. Then there's material evidence, archaeological evidence, and part of what you have to do is you actually have to go to the places. It's pretty much impossible to do this. So in June, for instance, I was in Israel. I've been there before, but this time I went with some very specific goals in mind of looking at sites and museums that were important for these revolts. and there's just really a lot there. There's a
Yeah.
lot.
I think I was there for 16 days. It's a booming economy now, and I've never quite, I had been there twice before, but I'd never seen that level of economic prosperity.
Oh, it's amazing. I lived in Tel Aviv in the 1980s, and I felt like Rip Van Winkle. I mean, I've been back since, but Tel Aviv is a totally different place than it was.
It is. And some of these places you go aren't so easy to get to, are they? Even if the ones that are in Europe.
No, they're not always easy to get to.
Yes.
You know? When I was younger, I would always rent my own cars to go there. Nowadays, I think it may be safer for me to have drivers.
I think so.
Off the beaten path, absolutely.
You've been a lot more successful than I have going to ancient places, because I think I had a torn ureter with a kidney stone in Athens, and I had malaria in Egypt, and I had a ruptured appendix in Libya, and I kind of learned my lesson about what you're talking about.
You've given a lot for the team. What can I say?
Or a lot to my self-indulgence. So we're over, Barry, and thank you very much. The book is The War That Made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian at Actium, and Barry's working on another one on rebels that we hope to have him back. And with that, thank you very much for coming, and thank everybody for listening to another Hoover Institution book review. Thank you.
Great.